If I leave now, I won't reach town alive. The servant fell at the Navajo's feet, begging for mercy. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The sun hung low in the sky as the servant stumbled through the barren desert landscape, her breath shallow and ragged. The air was thick with heat, every step feeling like a burden on her already exhausted body. The harsh landscape stretched endlessly before her, with nothing but the occasional dry bush and the distant silhouette of rocky outcrops marking the path. She had been walking for hours, her feet blistered and sore, and she knew she was pushing herself beyond her limits. Her heart raced as she thought of the small town she was desperately trying to reach. It was still miles away, but her body was giving out, and she feared that if she didn't make it soon, she wouldn't make it at all. With each passing minute, the weight of her situation pressed harder on her chest. She had no water, no food, and no means of protection. Her heart was heavy with fear, knowing the dangers that lurked in the wild, unprotected land. She had heard stories of what happened to those who wandered too far from safety, and she feared that she might soon become one of those tragic tales. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the desert floor, she knew that time was running out. The weight of her desperation was suffocating. Her legs wobbled beneath her, and as the world around her started to blur, she could feel herself losing consciousness. That was when she heard it, the sound of hooves in the distance. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, a trick of the heat. But the sound grew louder, closer, and then a figure emerged from the horizon. A rider, clad in weathered clothing and mounted on a powerful horse, appeared like a mirage, his presence a sharp contrast to the desolation around them. The servant could barely keep her eyes open as he approached, but she managed to gather the strength to drop to her knees in front of him, her body shaking from exhaustion and fear. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I won't make it to the town alive if I leave now." She felt her words falter as she gasped for breath, the reality of her situation sinking in. She had reached her breaking point. The rider halted his horse, his eyes scanning the landscape around them. For a moment, the two of them were locked in a tense silence, the weight of the desert pressing on both of them. Then, without a word, the rider dismounted and moved toward her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a calm intensity in his movements that suggested he knew exactly what was at stake. With a steady hand, he reached down, gently lifting her from the ground as if she weighed nothing at all. "You are safe now," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. The servant barely registered his words, her body too weak to comprehend what was happening. She was no longer in the desert, no longer alone. She was in the hands of someone who had appeared at the very moment she thought all hope was lost. The ride to safety would be long, but for the first time in hours, she felt a glimmer of hope. The rider's grip was firm as he lifted the servant from the dusty ground, her weak body cradled in his arms. She barely registered the motion, her mind foggy from exhaustion, but she could feel the soft, rhythmic movement of his horse beneath her as he gently placed her in the saddle in front of him. Her head rested against his chest, the sounds of the desert fading into the background, replaced by the steady beat of his heart. He did not speak, but she could sense his presence, calm, assured, yet unyielding. The world around them was silent save for the distant calls of birds and the soft shuffle of the horse's hooves against the dirt. As they rode on, the weight of the desert sun began to ease, replaced by a cooler breeze that cut through the heat like a balm. The servant's eyelids fluttered open, the exhaustion still clinging to her limbs, but the sudden change in the air lifted some of the heaviness in her chest. She felt an unfamiliar sense of safety, but it was fleeting. Her mind, still reeling, struggled to grasp her new reality. She had no idea where they were headed or what lay ahead. Her world had been so narrow, so desperate, that she had never imagined a chance like this would come to her. She glanced up at the rider. His features were set in a determined, almost stoic expression, his dark eyes scanning the horizon as if anticipating something unseen. She could tell he was no stranger to hardship, His rugged appearance and silent demeanor spoke volumes. He had not asked her questions, had not prodded her for details about why she had been alone in the desert, about the torment that had led her to this moment. For the first time in what felt like years, she felt the pressure of her pain ease as she allowed herself to rest in his care. The ride was long, each hour stretching into another, but with each passing moment, she began to feel more grounded. They passed through rugged terrain, thick with dry brush and jagged rocks, the sun now a mere sliver on the horizon. When they finally reached a small, hidden oasis, she was too tired to question it. The rider guided the horse toward a cluster of trees where the shade provided temporary relief from the relentless heat. He helped her dismount and gently set her down by the water. She could barely keep her eyes open, but she felt him crouch beside her, offering her a canteen of water. She drank greedily, savoring the cool liquid as it replenished her dry throat. As she finished, she looked up at him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still hoarse. He nodded but said nothing. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but filled with understanding, a recognition of mutual respect. He placed his hand on her shoulder, steadying her as she tried to stand. She was weak, but the thirst was gone, and the weight in her chest seemed lighter. "You've made it this far," he said, his voice deep but not unkind. "You'll make it through." She nodded slowly, her eyes tracing his silhouette against the fading light. He had no reason to help her, no obligation, and yet he had. His presence offered. No promises, only the quiet certainty of someone who knew the weight of survival in this unforgiving land. She could feel the shift in the air, the moment when something unspoken passed between them, when she realized that this man, this stranger, had offered her more than just a chance at survival. He had offered her a second chance at life. She felt a stir of emotion, something deep and unspoken, but she pushed it away. The time for questions would come later. For now, she allowed herself to rest. He had saved her once, but it was still unclear whether she could ever repay the debt she felt she owed him. But for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to dream of a future where mercy was not just a fleeting hope, but a reality. The night crept in slowly, the stars beginning to appear in the vast expanse above. As she lay down on the soft grass, feeling the coolness of the earth beneath her, she closed her eyes and let herself sleep, not as a servant, but as a woman who had been saved by an unexpected hand. And in the quiet darkness, she found a small seed of hope take root. The next morning, the servant woke to the sound of the wind rustling through the trees above her. The oasis was calm, and the faint sound of the nearby stream filled the air, providing a peaceful contrast to the chaos of the desert she had escaped. She could feel the warmth of the sun already starting to rise, casting long shadows over the ground. She blinked, still disoriented from the sleep that had overtaken her the night before, and slowly sat up. The rider had been awake for some time, his silhouette visible as he stood by the water, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was focused, like a man who had seen far too much and trusted little. She rubbed her eyes, her body still aching from the journey, but the worst of her exhaustion had passed. She felt stronger now, though she knew she wasn't out of danger yet. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs still shaky from the ordeal. As she stood, the rider turned and saw her moving. He walked over to her, his steps purposeful but not hurried. "Feeling better?" he asked, his voice still deep, but warmer now. She nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was. She still felt fragile, as if the world might crumble beneath her at any moment. "Yes," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "I think so." He gestured toward the small campfire they had built the night before, where a pot of water was heating over the flames. "Get some food in you," he said simply. "We still have a long way to go." The servant hesitated for a moment, looking at the fire and then back at him. There was something about him that she couldn't quite place, something that made her trust him, even though she had only known him for a short time. He didn't have to help her. He didn't have to do anything for her. But he had, and that meant something. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "For everything." He gave her a brief nod, his expression unreadable. "You're welcome," he said, but his tone lacked the warmth she expected. It was almost as if he were speaking more out of obligation than kindness. The servant didn't press him. Instead, she sat by the fire and ate the small portion of food he had prepared for her. It wasn't much, just some dried meat and a little bread, but it was enough to satisfy her hunger. As they ate in silence, she noticed something strange in his demeanor. He wasn't exactly unfriendly, but there was a certain detachment about him, as if he was carrying some weight that kept him from being fully present. She wondered what kind of man he was, what had brought him here to the desert. He didn't seem like the kind to offer help freely. After a moment, the servant spoke again, this time with a question she had been carrying since they met. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. He didn't look at her right away, but instead focused on the fire. His jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment, she thought he might not answer. But then, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "I've seen what happens to people like you out here," he said. "You're not the first to need help, and you won't be the last. I've been where you are, alone, with no one to turn to." His gaze shifted to her then, meeting her eyes for the first time that morning. "I know what it's like to survive by any means necessary." The servant felt a chill run down her spine. There was something haunting about the way he spoke, a deep sadness in his eyes that she couldn't quite understand. She had been in survival mode for so long that she hadn't really considered what it would mean to rely on someone else, to trust someone enough to open up. But she saw something in him now, something that made her feel less alone, even if just for a moment. "I don't know how to repay you," she said quietly. He gave a small shake of his head. "You don't have to repay me," he said. "But if you want to make it through, you need to trust me." She met his eyes again, and in that moment, something shifted between them. She realized that she had no choice but to trust him, not just for the journey ahead, but for her own survival. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves above them, and the servant looked toward the horizon. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel entirely hopeless. They would move forward, together. With the rider leading the way, she knew that her chances of survival had just increased. He wasn't just a stranger anymore. He had become her protector, the one person who would help her navigate a world that had been harsh and unforgiving. And for that, she was more grateful than words could express. As they finished their meal, he stood up, preparing to continue their journey. "It's time to go," he said. The servant stood, wiping her hands on her worn dress. She was ready, more ready than she had ever been. She had nothing left to lose, and for the first time in days, she felt like she might have something to gain. They traveled for hours, the landscape changing slowly as they moved further into the heart of the rugged wilderness. The servant was beginning to feel the strain of the journey, but the rider kept a steady pace, leading her through the desolate terrain with a confidence she couldn't help but admire. The heat of the day was beginning to wane, and the sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the jagged rocks and sparse vegetation. The air had a crispness to it now, the cool evening breeze offering some relief from the blistering heat they had endured all day. The servant could feel her strength returning slowly, the exhaustion from the previous days beginning to fade as her body adjusted to the rhythm of travel. They had passed through several stretches of open desert, where the earth seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, before finally entering a small valley surrounded by steep cliffs. It was here, in the shadow of those towering rocks, that the rider halted his horse. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable as always, but there was a hint of something softer in his gaze now. "We'll camp here for the night," he said, his voice low but steady. The servant nodded, grateful for the rest. She dismounted slowly, still feeling the effects of the long ride. Her legs wobbled slightly as she stood on solid ground, but the sensation of being off the horse was a relief. She felt the weight of her exhaustion slowly catch up with her, and she found herself longing for sleep. The rider busied himself with setting up the camp, his movements efficient and practiced. He worked in silence, his focus entirely on the task at hand. The servant, however, sat on a rock nearby, her mind racing with thoughts she had no way of sorting through. She had been rescued from certain death, but she had no idea what lay ahead. She had no way of knowing what her life would be now, or what role she would play in the rider's world. He had shown her kindness, but there was a distance to him, a wall he kept between himself and others that she couldn't quite breach. As she sat there, her eyes drifting toward the flickering campfire, she realized that she didn't know anything about him. She didn't even know his name. It was a strange feeling, to be traveling alongside someone who had saved her life, yet remain a complete stranger. She wasn't sure if she should ask him, if it was even something he would want to share. As if sensing her thoughts, the rider glanced over at her, his expression still neutral, but his eyes betraying a hint of curiosity. He had caught her looking at him, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he continued with his work, building the fire and preparing a simple meal for them both. When the food was ready, he handed her a bowl, his gaze briefly meeting hers. "Eat," he said, his tone just as firm as it had been before, but there was a subtle softness in his words now. She took the bowl from him, their fingers briefly brushing, and for a moment, the tension between them seemed to dissolve. She ate in silence, her body aching from the journey, but her mind grateful for the respite. The rider sat across from her, watching the fire as it crackled and popped. He seemed lost in thought, his face illuminated by the warm glow of the flames. The servant wanted to ask him about himself, about the life he led and why he had come to her aid, but something held her back. It wasn't fear exactly, but rather an understanding that some questions didn't need to be asked. Perhaps it was enough that he was here, that he had shown her kindness when no one else had. The night passed slowly, the stars emerging one by one as the fire burned low. The servant lay down near the warmth of the embers, her body finally relaxing into the ground beneath her. She had learned to sleep on the hard earth in her years of servitude, but tonight it felt different. There was a sense of safety here, in this small camp tucked away in the valley, surrounded by the silence of the wilderness. She closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the night lull her into a deep sleep. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, she was alive, and that was enough. The rider sat by the fire long after she had fallen asleep, staring into the flames. His thoughts were heavy, his mind plagued by the memories of battles fought and lost, of people saved and left behind. He didn't know why he had helped her, why he had chosen to save this woman in the desert, but something about her had struck a chord deep within him. She was a reminder of everything he had once lost, of a life he had abandoned long ago. And yet, in saving her, he had found something he hadn't realized he was missing. Perhaps, just perhaps, this journey would offer him more than he had expected. But for now, he kept his watch over her, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, and new dangers. He would be ready, as always. The morning sun was rising slowly, casting a golden glow across the valley where the two travelers had spent the night. The servant woke first, as she often did, her body stiff from the hard ground, but her mind clear. She sat up slowly, stretching her sore muscles, and looked over at the rider. He was still asleep, his form silhouetted against the faint light of the dawn. For a moment, she studied him, trying to make sense of the man who had so quietly entered her life. He was a mystery to her, a man with no name, no past shared, and no promises made. Yet, despite the distance he kept, he had saved her life, and that alone made him someone she would never forget. She stood up and began to gather her things, preparing herself for the journey ahead. The landscape had changed little overnight. The rugged cliffs stood tall around them, the silence of the wilderness still pressing down. She knew that the rider would be ready soon, as always, and that there would be no more time for reflection. It was time to move on. The fire was almost out, the last remnants of the night's warmth evaporating into the cold morning air. She watched the flames flicker and die, the wind sweeping away the final embers, and felt a deep sense of gratitude for the small comforts she had been given. The rider stirred beside her, the sound of his movements soft but deliberate. He stood up, stretched, and then turned to face her. His face was unreadable, his gaze distant. "We should keep moving," he said, his voice low and steady as always. She nodded without a word, gathering her things and preparing to mount the horse. The silence between them was never uncomfortable, but it was always there, like an unspoken understanding that neither of them could change. As they mounted their horses, the servant couldn't help but wonder where this journey was leading them. She had no idea how far they had traveled or how much farther they had to go. What was the rider's purpose? Why had he come to her aid when so many others had simply walked past? She knew he wasn't like the others. There was something different about him, something more profound that she couldn't explain. As they rode on, the landscape grew even more desolate. The valley opened up into a wide expanse of land, the harsh desert stretching as far as the eye could see. The servant felt the familiar fear creeping back into her chest as she realized how vulnerable they were. In these open spaces, There was no place to hide, no shelter from the elements or the dangers that lurked in the wilderness. She glanced over at the rider, who seemed completely at ease in the harsh landscape, his face calm and composed. It was as if he had lived here all his life, as if the desolation was something he had become accustomed to. For the first time since they had started their journey together, she felt a pang of doubt. Could she survive this? She wasn't sure if she had the strength to keep going, but she pushed the thought aside, focusing on the present. There was no time to second-guess herself. As the hours passed, the heat of the day began to set in, the sun rising higher in the sky and making the air shimmer with intensity. The servant began to feel the fatigue creeping back into her bones. She could feel the dryness in her throat, the hunger gnawing at her stomach, but she knew better than to complain. She had seen enough to understand that survival here was a silent struggle, one where words had little value. The rider did not speak, did not offer comfort, but his presence alone gave her a strange sense of reassurance. He had proven himself to be someone who could be relied upon. When they finally stopped to rest for a while, the servant felt a sense of relief. The rider had found a small patch of shade beneath a rock formation, and they dismounted to rest. She sat down on a flat stone, wiping the sweat from her brow as she watched him set about making a small fire. She noticed how quickly and efficiently he worked, how each movement was deliberate and purposeful. As he prepared a small meal, she realized that she had never asked him what his plans were, or what had brought him out here in the first place. She didn't know if it was the right moment, but the curiosity gnawed at her. "What brought you out here?" she asked, her voice tentative. He didn't look up at first, but after a moment, he answered. "I've been where you are," he said simply. "Running from something. Searching for something." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if he would say more. But then he added, "We all have our reasons for being here. Some of us are just trying to survive." The servant didn't push him further. She could tell that he wasn't ready to share more, and she respected that. In a strange way, his words gave her some comfort. She wasn't the only one with a past, with pain and loss. They were both just trying to survive, trying to find some measure of peace in a world that had offered little of it. As they sat in silence, the sun dipping lower in the sky, the servant realized that she had never truly known what it meant to trust someone completely. But here, in this desolate land, she was beginning to understand. It wasn't about promises or explanations. It was about knowing that, for a brief moment, they were in this together. The days passed with a steady, unyielding rhythm. The servant and the rider continued their journey through the rugged wilderness, the vast expanse of the desert stretching endlessly before them. The harsh sun had become a constant companion, bearing down on them with a relentless intensity. But as the days turned into weeks, the servant began to feel a strange sense of calm, a quiet acceptance of the harshness around them. It was as if the desert itself had taught her to endure, to keep moving forward, no matter the obstacles. They had traveled far from where she had first collapsed, from the place where she had thought her life would end. Yet, even as the miles added up, she still didn't know where they were headed. The rider had not shared his plans with her, nor had he spoken much about himself. She had long since stopped asking, content to follow his lead. She had learned that questions could wait. She had learned to trust him, though the trust was quiet, unspoken. It was a trust built on actions, not words. Every day, he had shown her his reliability, his strength, his ability to survive in a world that had no mercy. And in return, she had done her best to keep up, to hold her own. But it wasn't always easy. The journey was exhausting, the land unforgiving. The servant found herself growing weaker with each passing day. The thirst in her throat was constant, the hunger never fully sated. Yet, she continued on, not out of stubbornness but because there was no other choice. Her life, as it had been, was gone. This new life, with the rider, was all she had. As the heat of the day began to fade, the sky above them slowly darkened, and the servant could see the distant silhouette of a mountain range in the far distance. It wasn't much, but it was something, a sign that their journey might soon be nearing its end. The rider, however, did not seem to notice. He kept his focus straight ahead, his eyes scanning the horizon as always. She wondered where they were going. Were they heading for safety, or would they be facing new dangers soon? She had no way of knowing. But for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond the harshness of the desert. The rider's steady pace had become a rhythm, She could almost set her own heartbeat too. The sun was setting behind them, the colors in the sky shifting from pale blue to fiery orange, casting long shadows across the land. As they stopped for the night, she felt the weight of the journey settle into her bones. But there was something else too, something lighter. A sense of hope. The fire crackled as they set up camp, the smell of cooking food mixing with the scent of the desert air. The servant sat down by the fire, grateful for the warmth and the comfort. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The rider handed her a bowl of food, his face impassive but his actions steady and sure. He had always been like this, silent, focused, and reliable. She had no idea what he was thinking, but somehow, she didn't feel the need to know. He was there, and that was enough. As they ate, the servant looked at him, studying his face in the firelight. He had never shown much emotion, but tonight, for the first time, she saw something different. A flicker of something in his eyes, something that wasn't as guarded as before. She wanted to ask him, to know more about his past, about why he helped her, but she held back. There was no need for questions now. They were both here, together, and that was all that mattered. The wind picked up as the night wore on, the sound of it whistling through the rocks around them. The servant wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling the chill of the evening air seeping through the fabric. She looked up at the sky, the stars beginning to appear in the darkening expanse above. The vastness of the desert and the quiet beauty of the night made her feel small, but also strangely at peace. She had been lost, wandering in the wilderness, but now, with the rider by her side, she felt a sense of belonging that she had never known before. It was a quiet comfort, the kind that comes from knowing you are not alone, even in the most desolate of places. She closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the desert and the warmth of the fire lull her to sleep. As the night stretched on, the rider remained awake, his eyes scanning the land around them. He did not sleep much, always alert, always aware of the dangers that could appear at any moment. His mind was filled with thoughts he did not speak, burdens he carried alone. But tonight, as he looked at the servant, he felt something stir deep within him. He had saved her, yes, but in some ways, she had saved him too. She had brought a sense of purpose back into his life, a reminder that even in the most hopeless of places, there could be light. As the fire slowly died down, he stood and moved to the edge of the camp, his thoughts drifting as he looked out over the desert. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more miles to cover, but for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't facing it alone. The morning came with a soft whisper of wind, the faintest breath of the desert. The servant awoke slowly, the warmth of the fire still lingering in her bones, though the light of dawn had already begun to creep across the valley. She stretched her stiff limbs and sat up, scanning the familiar yet unwelcoming landscape. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long, stretching shadows across the earth, and for a moment, she allowed herself to simply breathe, to feel the stillness of the world around her. Her eyes shifted to the rider, who was already awake, packing his few belongings with the same quiet precision she had come to expect from him. His movements were efficient, almost mechanical, but there was something in the way he moved today that seemed different, a slight shift in his demeanor. He was no longer just the man who had saved her. He was someone she had come to depend on, someone whose presence she had learned to trust. Yet, still, the distance between them remained, an invisible barrier that neither of them seemed willing to cross. As they saddled the horses and prepared to leave, the servant felt a flicker of uncertainty. They had been traveling together for some time now, and though they had shared moments of silence, she couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. The open road stretched before them, but beyond that, she had no idea what their destination was. The rider had never said. They had simply kept moving, and for the most part, she had followed without question. But now, as they began their journey again, the weight of uncertainty settled over her once more. Where was he taking her? Why had he helped her? She wasn't sure how much longer she could live in this constant state of ambiguity. The path they traveled grew rougher as they moved deeper into the wilderness. The land seemed to become more barren with each passing mile, the earth cracked and dry beneath their horses' hooves. Yet, despite the harshness of their surroundings, there was something almost serene about the way the rider navigated the terrain. His horse moved with ease, and he rode with the fluidity of someone who knew the land well. The servant followed behind, trying to keep pace, though she could feel the strain in her muscles from the previous day's journey. The air grew heavier, the sun higher, and she found herself longing for the shade, for the comfort of a cool breeze. As they rode, the rider occasionally glanced back at her, but said little. His face remained as unreadable as always, but she could see the way his jaw tightened, the subtle signs of something deeper within him, something he didn't speak of. She longed to ask him, to push him for answers, but she knew better. There was no point in pressing. He would speak when he was ready, if ever. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher in the sky, the landscape becoming more and more unforgiving. The servant's body was beginning to rebel, her thirst growing unbearable, but she kept silent, determined to continue. The rider, too, seemed unaffected by the conditions, his focus unwavering. As the day wore on, they stopped for a brief rest under the sparse shade of a lone tree, the heat making it difficult to breathe. The servant dismounted, her legs shaky from the ride, and collapsed onto the ground, grateful for the chance to rest. The rider, as usual, remained standing, his eyes scanning the horizon, vigilant as ever. She watched him for a moment, studying his silent composure, the way he always seemed so unshaken by the world around him. It was as if nothing could touch him, nothing could break through the stoic exterior he had built around himself. She wanted to ask him what he was looking for, what he hoped to find in this endless desert, but again, she stayed quiet. She had learned that words, with him, meant little. It was the actions that spoke louder. After a time, they mounted their horses again and continued on. The terrain grew harsher still, the heat more oppressive. The servant's breath grew shallow, and she found herself growing dizzy, the world around her spinning in the heat. She pushed through it, unwilling to stop, unwilling to show any weakness. The rider, as always, showed no sign of concern. His eyes remained fixed ahead, his expression still unreadable, but there was a slight change in his posture, a subtle shift, as if he had sensed her growing distress. He slowed his horse slightly, allowing her to catch up, though he still said nothing. She wanted to thank him for this, for the small gesture of concern, but the words caught in her throat. She had been so focused on keeping pace with him, on surviving, that she had never truly acknowledged the unspoken bond between them. Perhaps she was wrong, but she couldn't help but feel that, in some small way, they understood each other. Two people brought together by chance, by circumstance, and now bound by a shared struggle to survive. Hours passed, the journey taking its toll, but the rider remained steady, unwavering. The servant, though exhausted, kept her focus on the road ahead, trusting that he would guide them to safety. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of red and orange, they reached a small ravine. The rider pulled his horse to a stop, his eyes scanning the area. "We'll camp here for the night," he said, his voice low but firm. The servant nodded, relieved. They had made it through another day, but she knew that the hardest part of the journey was still to come. As the evening deepened, the air grew cooler, and the fading light painted the ravine with a soft, amber glow. The servant felt the weight of the journey press down on her, but it was a relief to know they had found a place to rest for the night. The rider, as usual, was already at work, gathering what little firewood could be found in the sparse desert landscape. His movements were efficient and purposeful, but there was something different in the air tonight. The tension that had always been present between them felt heavier, more palpable. She sat by the small campfire he had started, watching the flames dance in the growing darkness, her mind swirling with questions she had never dared ask. What did he want from her? Was there more to this journey than just survival? She was beginning to feel the weight of her own uncertainty. It was one thing to trust him in the heat of the moment, when survival was the only thing that mattered. But now, as they settled into the rhythm of the journey, she realized that she still didn't know who he was or why he had helped her. The rider was a mystery to her. He had never spoken much about his past, his motivations, or even his plans. He had simply been there when she needed him, and that had been enough. But now, sitting by the fire, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, more to him than he was willing to reveal. She looked up at him now as he finished securing the horses and walked over to where she sat. He offered her a simple meal of dried meat and bread, and she took it gratefully, though her stomach had long since grown accustomed to hunger. As they ate in silence, the servant could feel his eyes on her, though he said nothing. His presence, as always, was both comforting and unsettling. "Do you ever stop?" she asked, the words escaping before she had time to reconsider them. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" "Do you ever stop moving?" she clarified. "Do you ever let yourself rest?" The question seemed to hang in the air between them, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but it was enough to make her wonder. The rider didn't answer right away. He finished his meal, his gaze shifting back to the fire. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I've learned that rest is a luxury," he said, his voice low, almost to himself. "In this world, you never know when the danger will find you. So you keep moving, keep your guard up. That's how you survive." The servant listened to his words, feeling the weight of them settle over her. It was true, she knew. She had learned that lesson early, that in a world as unforgiving as this, survival was all that mattered. But somehow, the rider's words felt different, as if he was speaking from experience, from a life that had taught him more than he cared to remember. She looked at him, seeing for the first time the depth of weariness in his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. He was a man who had lived through things, who had seen the darkness in the world and had fought to stay alive. And yet, there was a distance in him, a wall that kept him from letting anyone get too close. The servant could feel it now, that wall, as thick as the desert dust that covered the earth beneath their feet. And yet, despite that distance, she found herself wanting to reach out, to understand him, to know what made him who he was. But she didn't. She couldn't. She knew. Better than to press him. She had learned long ago that some things were better left unsaid. The fire crackled softly in the stillness of the night, and the sound of the desert wind whispered through the ravine. The servant stared into the flames, her thoughts heavy. She had come so far from the woman she had once been. She was no longer just a servant, no longer just a woman on the edge of survival. She was something else now. She was part of this journey, part of whatever this strange partnership with the rider had become. And yet, there were still so many unanswered questions. What was he running from? What did he want? The night stretched on, the stars growing brighter overhead. She had become accustomed to the silence, to the way the rider remained so distant, so focused on the road ahead. But tonight, as she looked at him sitting across the fire, she couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to his story, something he had yet to share. It was a feeling she couldn't shake. The wind kicked up again, sending a chill through the air. The servant pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, trying to ward off the cold. She looked over at the rider again, but he had already turned his attention back to the fire, his face partially obscured in the shadows. For a moment, they simply sat there in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them. The servant knew that the journey ahead would be just as hard as the one they had already traveled. And though she didn't know what lay in store for them, she knew that, somehow, they would make it through together. Even if the road ahead was uncertain, even if they never spoke of the things they kept hidden, they would survive. Together. The next morning, the silence of the desert was broken only by the soft crunch of gravel beneath their horses' hooves. The servant had slept little, her thoughts still heavy with the unspoken words between her and the rider. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat of the day began to settle over the landscape, but she had grown accustomed to it. The endless stretch of dry earth, the distant mountains, and the sparse vegetation were becoming a familiar sight. Yet with each passing mile, she felt the weight of her own uncertainty. What was she to him, really? The rider's presence was constant, his guidance unquestioned, but she still knew so little about him. Her heart was full of questions, but the silence that had existed between them since the beginning of their journey was a reminder that some things were never meant to be spoken. The rider led the way, as always, his face set in the same impassive expression that had become a part of him. He had saved her, yes, but even now, after all they had been through, she wasn't sure what that meant. Was it merely an act of kindness, or was there something deeper at play? She found herself thinking about the time he had spoken of survival. He had mentioned being where she was, alone, running from something. She wondered, if she pushed him, would he tell her more? She wanted to know who he really was, what drove him, but the fear of pushing too far held her back. She had learned the importance of patience, of understanding that not everything had an answer. Still, there was a nagging feeling inside her, a feeling that perhaps, if she waited long enough, the answers would come on their own. As they continued their journey, the road ahead grew more rugged. The landscape was beginning to change, the ground shifting from dry, cracked earth to rocky terrain that made the travel even harder. The air felt heavy, thick with dust and the ever-present heat. The servant's body ached, the constant riding wearing on her, but she kept silent, determined to follow. It was strange how this partnership had become a lifeline for both of them. She had once thought of survival as something solitary, something she would have to face alone. But here she was, relying on a man she barely knew. He hadn't asked for anything in return, and yet, she knew that she had to offer him something in return. She could no longer simply be the one who received. She had to be the one who gave. The idea of it made her uneasy. She had no skills of value, no possessions of worth. What could she possibly offer someone like him? Her thoughts were interrupted by the rider's voice, breaking the stillness that had hung between them. "We need to make it to the next waterhole before sundown," he said, his tone as direct as ever. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She knew he was right. The heat was getting worse, and they needed to rest before it became unbearable. The thought of the waterhole, cool and refreshing, gave her a sense of purpose. It was something tangible, something they could reach, something that would sustain them for the journey ahead. The next few hours passed in relative silence, the only sounds being the soft padding of hooves on the earth and the occasional sigh of wind. As they approached the waterhole, the servant felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had been thinking about nothing else but that cool water, imagining the sensation of it on her parched throat, the feeling of it against her skin. The sight of the waterhole came into view as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting an orange glow across the landscape. It was small, but enough to quench their thirst. The rider dismounted first, moving toward the water with the practiced ease of someone who had lived in these conditions for a long time. He crouched beside it, taking a long drink from his canteen before turning to offer it to her. She accepted gratefully, her hands trembling slightly as she unscrewed the lid. The cool water was a welcome relief, soothing her dry throat and quenching the thirst that had gnawed at her for hours. For a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over her. The rider, standing nearby, was watching her, his expression still unreadable. But something about the way he stood, his posture relaxed yet alert, made her feel like she wasn't alone. She finished her drink and looked at him. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. He nodded in acknowledgement, but said nothing. The silence stretched between them, more comfortable now than before. The servant realized she had grown used to it, the quiet that surrounded them, the way they didn't need words to understand each other. There was a certain peace in that, in knowing that sometimes silence was enough. As the sun set, the temperature dropped, and they set up camp near the waterhole. The night would be colder than the days they had been traveling, but they had food, water, and shelter, and that was enough. The servant sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance in the stillness of the desert night. The rider moved about with quiet efficiency, preparing for whatever lay ahead. She glanced at him again, the questions still there, unanswered, but for the first time, she wasn't bothered by them. Maybe some things didn't need to be asked. Maybe some things were better left unknown. She wasn't sure, but for now, as they sat together by the fire, she felt a sense of calm. She wasn't alone, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel lost. The journey was far from over, but they had made it this far together. And that, she thought, was enough. The morning came quickly, the sky still dark, but the first light of dawn was beginning to break over the horizon. The air was cool, but the warmth of the day would soon arrive. The servant woke, feeling a strange sense of peace. They had traveled far over the past days, and though the road ahead was uncertain, she felt stronger. There was no longer that overwhelming sense of dread that had once gripped her chest every time she woke, uncertain of what lay ahead. She had come to understand something about the journey, that it wasn't just about surviving the desert. It was about surviving the quiet, the uncertainty, the unknown. And in that, she was beginning to find her strength. She stood up, stretching her limbs, trying to shake off the stiffness that had settled in overnight. The rider was already awake, as he always was, silently preparing the horses for the day ahead. His face was still as unreadable as ever, but there was something in the way he moved today, a subtle change that caught her attention. For the first time in days, she realized that she didn't feel quite as dependent on him as she had before. The journey had taught her more than survival. It had taught her to become more self-reliant. She knew she couldn't have made it this far without him, but she was beginning to see the way forward on her own terms. She wasn't sure what that meant yet, but she could feel something stirring inside her, a quiet sense of possibility. She watched him for a moment longer as he checked the supplies, his movements swift and practiced. He was a man of few words, but he was someone who could be relied upon. She had come to realize that, just as much as she had learned to trust herself, she had learned to trust him. He didn't ask for anything in return for his help, never expecting gratitude, never seeking anything more than survival. She had never known someone like him, and perhaps that was part of the mystery. Perhaps it was part of the reason she still didn't know what to make of him. He was a stranger, but he wasn't. The questions that had plagued her about him, about who he was, about why he had chosen to help her, had begun to fade in the wake of something else. She wasn't sure if that was a relief or a regret. As she prepared for the day, the sun began to rise higher, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The warmth of the sun felt good against her skin. She mounted her horse, her muscles sore, but her mind clearer than it had been in days. The rider mounted his own horse, and they rode in silence, as they always did, moving deeper into the desert. The vastness of the land seemed to stretch forever before them, the endless horizon filled with dust and sun. The landscape was both beautiful and forbidding, the rugged terrain offering no mercy to those who traveled it. As they made their way through the desert, the servant couldn't help but wonder how much longer they would have to travel. She had no way of knowing how much farther they had to go, but she had learned to live without knowing. In a way, it was freeing. It had taken time, but she was starting to accept that not all questions had answers, and not all journeys had a clear destination. Sometimes, survival itself was the destination. The road grew rougher as they ventured further. The land was harsh, the ground cracked and dry beneath them. But they pressed on, as they had done every day. There was no choice but to move forward. It was a rhythm now, a routine that had become as much a part of her as the breath in her lungs. Hours passed in the same quiet pace, the heat becoming oppressive. But neither of them stopped. The servant found herself lost in thought, but it wasn't as consuming as it had been before. The weight of her questions had lessened, and a sense of clarity was beginning to take its place. She was still alive. She had made it this far, and she would continue to survive. When they reached a small oasis by late afternoon, the relief was palpable. The sun had taken its toll on both of them, and the promise of shade and water was a welcome respite. They dismounted, the servant feeling the weight of her exhaustion settle in her bones. As they rested by the water, the rider spoke for the first time since morning. "We'll stay here for the night," he said, his tone soft but firm. The servant nodded, grateful for the pause in their journey. The relief of being out of the sun, of sitting beside the cool water, was almost overwhelming. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the stillness wash over her. The air was quieter here, the gentle rustle of leaves the only sound. She had grown used to the constant movement, the relentless travel, but now, in this small moment of calm, she realized how much she needed it. The rider moved around, securing their supplies, making sure the horses were properly watered. She watched him, still silent, still distant. He was the same as ever, and yet something had shifted. She didn't know if it was in him or in her, but it felt different. As the sun set and the temperature dropped, the two of them sat by the fire, eating the simple meal the rider had prepared. The servant looked at him, the same questions still in her mind, but for once, she didn't feel the urge to ask. She had realized something in this quiet moment. The answers, if they were meant to come, would come when they were ready. For now, they were both here, together, and that was enough. She had come to appreciate the silence between them, the unspoken understanding that had formed. The fire crackled softly, the flames casting long shadows over the land. The desert, vast and unforgiving, seemed to soften in the warmth of the fire. The journey was far from over, but for now, there was peace in the stillness. The servant closed her eyes, leaning back against the ground, feeling the quiet of the desert seep into her bones. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, she felt safe. Tonight, she felt alive. The fire was burning low when the rider stood up, his silhouette outlined against the darkening sky. The servant had been staring into the flames, letting her thoughts drift as they always did during their quiet nights by the fire. The desert had a way of making you reflect, even when you didn't want to. She had come a long way since that first day, when she had thought she wouldn't make it through the heat, the hunger, and the fear. Yet, here she was, sitting by a fire with a man who had become as much a part of her survival as the air she breathed. The rider's figure remained still, watching the horizon. His stance was relaxed, but there was something in the way he held himself, something that spoke of constant vigilance, of a man who had learned to never let his guard down. The servant watched him quietly. She had learned a lot from him, mostly without words. His actions had taught her more about strength, survival, and resilience than any conversation could have. But now, as the night deepened and the fire crackled softly, she realized she wanted to know more. She wanted to understand the person behind the stoic exterior, the man who had saved her and asked for nothing in return. As if sensing her thoughts, the rider turned slightly, his eyes catching hers in the firelight. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence between them not awkward, but somehow full of unspoken understanding. Then he spoke. "Tomorrow will be harder," he said, his voice low but clear. "The desert doesn't get any easier the farther you go." She nodded, her mind already turning to the challenges ahead. It wasn't that she doubted him. He had been right about everything so far. It was just that there was something about the way he spoke, something that made the road ahead feel even more daunting. She swallowed, feeling the dryness in her throat. "How do you keep going?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the quiet peace they had found in each other's company. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath and turned his gaze back to the fire. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't respond, but then he did, his voice quieter than before. "You don't have a choice. You survive because that's what you do." His words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind of weight that only someone who had been through the hardest of times could understand. The servant sat in silence, absorbing his words. She had thought about survival for so long, but his perspective made her realize something. It wasn't just about enduring the desert, the heat, or the hunger. It was about the choice to keep moving, the choice to live. She had been surviving, but in many ways, she had been running from fear, from the past, from everything she couldn't control. But now, with him, she felt like she might have a chance to choose something different. She wasn't sure what that was yet, but the thought of it stirred something inside her. As the night stretched on, they both sat in silence, the fire flickering between them. The rider didn't move much, his mind clearly still far away. She could see the lines of exhaustion etched on his face, the weariness that had come from years of living a life on the edge. The servant wondered what had brought him to this life, what had shaped him into the man who stood before her now. She had learned so little about his past, but she knew that it had been hard. It had to have been. There was something in his eyes that spoke of loss, of battles fought and battles lost. Something that told her he didn't show weakness, not because he was afraid of it, but because he had learned that weakness could be deadly. The servant's eyes drifted toward the stars above. They were brighter tonight, the sky clear, unmarred by clouds or dust. The vastness of the desert stretched endlessly before them, and she felt small, yet strangely at peace. She didn't know where they were going, but in this moment, it didn't matter. She was alive, and that was enough. They had come so far, and somehow, they had done it together. That thought gave her strength. She turned back to the rider, who was still watching the fire. He seemed distant, lost in his thoughts. It was the first time in days that she had seen him like this, vulnerable, in a way, though he would never show it. She thought about what he had said. "You survive because that's what you do." It was more than a lesson. It was a truth she had lived with, but hadn't fully accepted. Now, sitting here beside him, she understood it in a way she hadn't before. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to live again. The night deepened, and the air grew colder. They both stood and moved to prepare for sleep. The rider checked the horses, ensuring everything was secure, while the servant gathered her things. There was nothing more to say, not right now. The journey would continue tomorrow, and the challenges ahead would be great. But for tonight, In this quiet, forgotten corner of the desert, they were safe. And for the first time, the servant didn't feel quite as alone. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that, for now, she had a purpose. She had a reason to keep going, a reason to face the road ahead. The fire flickered one last time before it died down completely, leaving only the stars above them and the promise of a new day. The morning air was crisp as the sun began to rise, painting the desert in soft hues of gold and orange. The servant awoke earlier than usual, her body sore from the constant motion of the past days. She stretched slowly, feeling the weight of the journey in her limbs. But today, there was something different. There was a quiet anticipation in the air, as if the very earth beneath her feet was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. The rider was already awake, as always. He was standing by the horses, checking their gear with the same efficiency that had become a part of him. His presence was constant, grounding her, but today, she felt a shift, a sense of something new in the way the morning felt, in the way the rider moved. She knew they had been traveling for what felt like weeks, through harsh terrain, always moving forward with no clear destination. Yet, this morning, something inside her stirred. The silence between them was still there, thick with unspoken words, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like an understanding. She stood up, brushing off the dirt from her clothes, and walked toward him. "Where are we headed today?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. The rider glanced at her, his eyes briefly meeting hers before shifting back to the horses. "We'll reach the next settlement by nightfall. It's not much, but it's a place to rest," he replied, his tone as calm as ever, yet there was a faint edge to it, something that suggested he was bracing for something. She nodded, taking in his words. She had learned not to ask too many questions about their destination, but something about his response made her wonder if today was going to be different. The journey had been long, but it felt like it had all been leading up to something, some moment she couldn't yet see. She mounted her horse, her movements more fluid now than before, her body growing accustomed to the long rides. The road ahead was still rough, the landscape just as unforgiving as it had been the day before, but there was a sense of purpose now, a quiet resolve that had settled within her. They rode in silence, the only sounds the soft thud of hooves on the dirt and the occasional rustle of wind through the sparse trees. As the hours passed, the landscape began to change. The dry, cracked earth was replaced by patches of scrub and small hills. It wasn't much, but it was a change, a sign that they were moving forward, that the end of their journey might be closer than she had imagined. The servant felt a twinge of excitement, mixed with a deep sense of exhaustion. She had learned to survive, to move forward, but the thought of finally reaching somewhere that felt like safety, even if only for a night, gave her a glimmer of hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. As the sun reached its peak, they finally arrived at the settlement. It was a small, dusty place, little more than a few wooden structures haphazardly thrown together, but it was a place. People moved about, their faces worn but hopeful. The servant could see the familiar signs of life, the same ones she had seen in every settlement they had passed through. There were traders, farmers, and families, each one with their own stories, their own struggles. It wasn't much, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt the stirrings of something more. The rider dismounted without a word, securing the horses as he moved toward the makeshift buildings. The servant followed his lead, unsure of what to expect. She was tired, so very tired, and yet there was something about the place that felt different. It was as if the weight of the road had been lifted for just a moment. They approached one of the larger buildings, a structure that looked like it might have been a saloon or a gathering place in better times. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of food and drink, the sounds of laughter and conversation filling the space. It was a small moment of normalcy in a world that had offered little of it. The rider made a brief exchange with one of the men inside, and soon, the servant was led to a small room in the back of the building. It wasn't much, just a cot and a small table, but it was enough. It was the first real rest she had in days, and she felt the tension in her body begin to ease as she sank onto the bed. She didn't know how long she had been riding, how many days had passed since she had last felt something resembling peace, but in that moment, with the coolness of the room and the quiet hum of the settlement outside, she allowed herself to relax. She closed her eyes, her thoughts drifting, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, something deeper than just the physical journey they were on. She wasn't sure what it was, but the feeling lingered, like a whisper in the back of her mind. After a while, the rider came back to the room, standing in the doorway for a moment before entering. "We'll stay here for the night," he said, his voice steady as always, but there was something softer in his tone. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his for the first time in a long while. "Thank you," she said, her voice quieter than usual, filled with a gratitude she hadn't been able to express before. He nodded, his face still as unreadable as ever, but there was something in the way he stood there, something that suggested he had heard her. For the first time since they had met, there was no need for words between them. The quiet understanding between them was enough. She settled into the cot as the rider left the room, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to drift into sleep, the weight of the journey momentarily forgotten. The morning arrived quietly, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the thin curtains of the small room where the servant had slept. She awoke slowly, her body sore from days of travel, but the rest had given her a new strength. The settlement was peaceful, the sounds of life outside a stark contrast to the harsh emptiness of the desert they had crossed. The rider had already left, as she expected. He had always risen early, always a step ahead, and though he had led her to this place of refuge, she knew the journey was far from over. She stood up and stretched, feeling the comfort of solid ground beneath her feet. She hadn't realized how much she'd longed for something stable, something that felt like home, even if just for a moment. The room was simple, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like a sanctuary. She washed her face with cold water from a basin beside the bed, the coolness of it waking her fully. The fatigue that had once been overwhelming now felt like a distant memory, though she knew it would return soon enough. She had learned the truth about survival. It wasn't just about enduring the harshness of the land, but about finding moments of peace within the chaos. As she dressed, she couldn't help but think about how far they had come, how much she had changed. When she first met the rider, she had been lost, desperate, and broken. Now, she was different, stronger, more resolute, and even though the uncertainty of the journey still loomed, she felt capable of facing whatever came next. The rider was waiting outside the room, his figure unmistakable even from a distance. He stood by the horses, his gaze scanning the settlement with the same alertness he had shown throughout their journey. The servant stepped outside, and as her eyes met his, she noticed a subtle shift in him. The usual distance between them, the silence that had marked their relationship, seemed to have lessened in the past few days. Perhaps it was the safety of the settlement, or perhaps it was the quiet bond that had formed between them through shared experience. The rider didn't say much, as usual, but his eyes softened when he looked at her, as if silently acknowledging the change. "We leave soon," he said, breaking the silence, his voice calm. But there was something different in the way he spoke. It was almost as though he was not just talking about the journey, but about something deeper, something more personal. She nodded, understanding without the need for further words. "I'm ready," she said. They mounted their horses, the familiar rhythm of travel beginning once more, but today it felt different. The air, though still hot, seemed lighter somehow, and the road ahead felt less daunting. The settlement was now behind them, fading into the distance as they rode on. The land around them was still harsh and unforgiving, but there was a new sense of purpose in their movements, a quiet determination. They didn't speak much as they traveled, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was an unspoken understanding that they didn't need to fill the space with words. They had already shared so much, not in the form of conversation, but in the way they had each supported the other, without question, without expectation. Hours passed, the landscape shifting as they moved through different stretches of terrain, but the servant no longer felt as if the journey was a burden. It was still hard, still grueling, but it was also something she could handle. They stopped for a break by the side of a small stream, the water running clear and cold over the rocks. She dismounted, grateful for the rest, and knelt to drink. The rider did the same, his movements efficient, but there was a subtle weariness in his posture that hadn't been there before. He wasn't invincible. She realized that now. The man who had led her through the worst of it, the one who had been so constant and unshaken, was not without his own struggles. She had known that survival was a solitary endeavor, but now she saw that even the strongest of them had their limits. He didn't need her to see this, but somehow, she felt like it was important that she did. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the stream filling the space between them. It wasn't an awkward silence, but one of those rare moments when no words were needed. The servant could feel the weight of the journey ahead, but it didn't feel as overwhelming now. With the rider beside her, there was a sense of peace that had settled within her, a quiet strength she hadn't realized she possessed until now. She glanced at him again, catching him looking at her, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. It was a fleeting connection, but it was enough to remind her that they were in this together, however long the road may be. He stood up, his gaze once again returning to the path ahead. "We keep moving," he said, and it wasn't a command. It was simply the truth. And so they did. They rode on, the road still long, the desert still endless, but there was a new understanding between them. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were moving towards something. Not just a place, but a future. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, the servant believed she could face whatever came next. The rider had shown her the way, not through words, but through his actions. And now, they moved forward, together, knowing that survival was not just about the road ahead, but about what they made of the journey itself. In this gripping tale of survival, betrayal, and unexpected bonds, two characters embark on a perilous journey across the unforgiving desert landscape, as their paths intertwine in a series of unpredictable events. With the vast expanse of the wilderness before them, the rider and the servant must navigate not only the harsh environment, but also the deeper emotional struggles that come with survival. As they push forward in the relentless heat, the two characters learn to rely on each other in ways they never anticipated. Their journey brings moments of quiet reflection, understanding, and subtle shifts in their connection, making it a story of personal growth amidst adversity. Set against the backdrop of the harsh desert, this story is a perfect example of Western stories that showcase resilience and the unspoken bonds that develop during trying times. Each step forward is fraught with challenges, yet there's an undeniable strength in the simplicity of their relationship, making it a compelling narrative that embodies the spirit of Western stories. As they face not only the unforgiving environment, but also their own inner turmoil, they learn that survival isn't just about fighting the elements. It's about learning to trust in each other and themselves. This story is an emotional and gripping journey, capturing the essence of Western stories in its raw, unfiltered portrayal of struggle, survival, and the human spirit. In the end, the characters discover that surviving isn't just about staying alive. It's about moving forward, no matter the cost, and finding meaning in the journey itself. These are the elements that make Western stories so enduring, capturing the heart and soul of the genre in every page.